Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another video. Before we begin, a lot of you know that I've been working with Vite Ramen for some sponsored videos recently, and some of you have mentioned that although you're interested in trying out the ramen, you can't either because it's too expensive or there's too much shipping or whatever else. Anyway, I mentioned that to the company and asked if we could do a giveaway, and they agreed, and actually made an extremely generous giveaway. I'll put a link where you can enter for free down in the comments, and there's 10 various prizes you guys can win. This isn't sponsored, I just wanted to share with you guys because I think it's quite generous. Anyway, moving on. The Star Wars galaxy has a sort of mixed history with cloning, in that it's almost always been illegal, but of course there have been several periods of intense cloning which took place. For example, the Clone Wars and the Thrawn campaign. However, before the Clone Wars, the practice, as I said, was illegal and thus limited to planets outside the jurisdiction of the Galactic Republic. For this reason, planets like Kamino, which itself was actually outside the galaxy proper, saw the majority of cloning research. And the Kaminoans basically made the best clones available and perfected the method. Interestingly though, the clones made by Kaminoan cloners are different than what we see in many other pieces of media. Unlike something like The Sixth Day, one of my guilty pleasure favorite movies, where the clones are essentially just copies of the cloned subject, the Django era clones were instead basically artificially created babies with accelerated growth and then some genetic modifications. The clones would not necessarily grow up to be just like Django, instead they were trained and would develop their own personalities, at least to an extent. The Republic would continue to use Kamino bred clones throughout the war, even introducing clones based on different genetic templates near the end of the conflict. However, one of the major issues faced by the Republic was not the skill of the clones, who proved to be incredibly capable, but the numbers. Kamino clones were engineered to grow twice as fast as normal humans, taking essentially a decade to create a fighter. The Republic was only able to make use of the army because it had been prepared and ordered in advance. This long time period actually hurts the viability of a massive army because it takes away what would otherwise be a massive advantage, being able to create a large force quickly. This is a problem that Thrawn actually grappled with during his campaign. He had inherited the majority of the Dark Force fleet, which was 200 pre-Clone Wars era dreadnoughts, but even with the reduced crew capacity, he was not able to secure the 400,000 personnel needed to put them into service. Or at least he wouldn't have been able to had he not prepared in advance. We'll talk about Thrawn and his discoveries in a moment, but before we do, I want to look at why clones are generally not grown quickly enough to really pump out armies at any sort of speed. I mean, if you think about it logically, it wouldn't take that long to actually grow the replacement human, especially imagining methods used by other pieces of media. So, Star Wars Legends prevents two major issues associated with growing clones quickly: clone insanity and clone performance. Let's talk about the boring one first: clone performance. As I mentioned, Kamino clones received most of their skill through training, and the actual cloning process itself was basically used to produce a genetically perfect baby. However, in this way, the Kamino process was basically unique. Most other cloning methods used something known as imprinting, where the cloning technology itself actually implanted the skill on the being, and thus clones would be grown as full adults. Imprinting usually involved flashing the clone template's memory onto the clone during the process. So, to put this very simply, you're not only creating a body, but also filling that body up with the memories and hopefully the inherent skill of the clone host, or perhaps a third party. Even in the perfect scenario where everything works out, it's questionable whether the clone will be as special or as effective as the original being. Here's a quote from Vision of the Future. "What do you think he'll be like?" Mara asked, her voice sounding odd. "I mean, how close to the original Thrawn will he be?" Luke shook his head. "That's an argument that's been going on for decades. With the same genetic structure, plus a flash learning pattern taken directly from the template, a clone should be theoretically completely identical to the original person. But despite that, they're never exactly the same. Maybe some of the mental subtleties get blurred over in transition, or maybe there's something else unique inside us that a flash learning reader isn't able to pick up. He'll presumably have all of Thrawn's memories, but will he have his genius, or his leadership, or his single-minded drive? I don't know. Later on in the book, we find out that Tierce, one of the antagonists himself, was a clone, and meant to be a combination of tactical genius and combat strength. However, his result was not what Thrawn was hoping for. The experiment was, according to Captain Pellaeon, a failure. But that was probably even still a best-case scenario. The flashing process is largely responsible for both flaws I mentioned above, clone madness and ineffectiveness, and it appears that learning abilities through training is much more effective than trying to have them flash to a clone. In the Order 66 Clone Commando novel, we see a squad of Sparti-grown clones which are significantly less effective than their Kamino brothers. Although they technically have the knowledge within them, they don't understand how to utilize it, and have almost no tactics and survival instinct. Thrawn's Sparti clones didn't seem to be as terrible, but to be honest, that's probably just a lore inconsistency, which is understandable given that the Thrawn trilogy and duology both came out before the prequels. Other non-Kamino clones, including those of the G-Node and Arcanian variety, also were largely trash. Arcanian clones, for example, according to the Essential Guide to Warfare, were simply subpar soldiers. However, this lack of skill was actually a minor issue compared to what was called clone madness. Clone madness, or insanity, was really the primary reason clones were forced to undergo a long period of incubation. Insane clones were not only, unsurprisingly, worse soldiers, but also incredibly dangerous and prone to just breaking. Here's a quote about the clone of Joruus C'baoth from The Last Command. Carefully, Pellaeon eased a little deeper into the Force-empty bubble that surrounded Thrawn's Islamir. At those times, when he was in control of himself, C'baoth appeared more confident and in control than he ever had been before. But at the same time, these violent bursts of clone madness were becoming more frequent and more vicious, like a system in a positive feedback loop, swinging further from its core point with each oscillation until it ripped itself apart. As we see throughout the entire trilogy, the insane clone of C'baoth was completely unable to be controlled and was prone to fits of extreme anger, violence, and just craziness. It also seems, based on context and especially the above quote, that the eventual self-destruction of this type of clone was inevitable. No matter how many times he saw it happen, he would never get used to these sudden dips into the slippery twilight of clone madness. It had, he knew, been a universal problem with the early cloning experiments, a permanent mental and emotional instability, inversely scaled to the length of the duplicate's growth cycle. Few of the scientific papers on the subject had survived the Clone Wars era, but Pellaeon had come across one that had suggested that no clone grown to maturity in less than a year would be stable enough to survive outside of a totally controlled environment. And the risks associated with short-grown clones were such that even upon discovering clones and the stolen katana dreadnoughts, the New Republic was not concerned with an immediate attack because they thought the clones would nonetheless take years to grow. Talon Card specifically says that the pre-Clone Wars documents that he said suggested a 3 to 5 year cycle, with 1 year being the absolute minimum. The reason for the madness is interesting. On a simple level and an obvious level, it seems that clones have an issue reconciling another being's memories within their own mind. I presume that that's similar to combat skill. It takes a while as the brain is developing to truly understand what it's learning. However, we also know that G-Node clones, for example, would react violently to discovering themselves surrounded by others who looked just like them. However, even with that controlled for, there was another element to clone madness: the Force itself. It's the Force, Leia told him. It was so obvious, so utterly obvious, and yet she'd missed it completely. Don't you see? When you make an exact duplicate of a sentient being, there's a natural resonance or something set up through the Force between that duplicate and the original. That's what warps the mind of a clone that's been grown too fast. There's not enough time for the mind to adapt to the pressure on it. It can't adjust. so it breaks. Thrawn got around this by surrounding the growing clones with Ysalamari, which was a genius move and only possible because he prepared in advance, but we see the resonance, as Leia calls it, directly with the clone of Sabayoth as he struggles to deal with pressures and memories of his last life that aren't quite his. So those two issues, clone underperformance and clone madness, explain why growing cycles were not shortened, and it seems like after Thrawn's campaign, no one else attempted to implement his strategy. That may be because usually it's not feasible to expand your military so quickly anyway. You have to get ships and material and weapons ready alongside the clones, and usually that will take almost as much time to get as the army itself. You also have to be able to support this new army. Clones still eat, they still drink, they still sleep, and Thrawn was only able to feed his new military because his early campaign focused on capturing planets like Yukio. Cloning as well was very expensive, and Sparty's cylinders were basically limited to what was already produced by the fall of the Empire. So I hope that makes sense. What do you guys think of these natural limits around cloning? Do you think that a newly grown body implanted with the memories of its genetic seed would be the same thing, or is there no way to capture experience and pass it on to a new being? Do you think the clone Thrawn being grown during the Thrawn duology would be as effective as the real Thrawn? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. Another video going long today, so again, I'll hold off the hashtag AskEck question until next time, but until then, have a great day, and as always, may the Force be with you.